Imagine that somewhere beneath the dust of the Judean hills, hidden inside a collapsed cave sealed for nearly 2,000 years, archaeologists uncover a small wooden chest. Inside rests a single parchment. Upon that parchment is a sketch drawn by a hand that once knew the most influential man in history. Not a theological symbol, not an icon, not a saint painted centuries later. A face. His face. How much of human history would change in a single moment? Before we discuss what Jesus may have looked like, we must confront a stranger mystery. How is it possible that one of the most recognizable figures on earth is also one of the least visually documented? Across churches, manuscripts, mosaics, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows, countless faces claim to represent him. Some possess long flowing hair. Others bear solemn eyes framed by golden halos. Yet the closer we move toward the 1st century, the more those familiar faces begin to disappear. The historical record shows something deeply unexpected. The earliest sources tell us what he taught. They tell us where he traveled. They tell us who followed him, who opposed him, and how he died. But when we ask a seemingly simple question, what did he actually look like? The sources fall strangely silent. This silence creates the central paradox of our investigation. We possess an enormous amount of information about the impact of his life, yet almost no direct description of his appearance. The evidence suggests that generations of artists, theologians, and believers attempted to fill this void. Others remain unconvinced that the void can ever truly be filled. The difficulty with every reconstruction is that it begins with absence rather than certainty. This raises a deeper question. Are we searching for a lost face hidden somewhere within history? Or are we confronting a deliberate silence preserved by history itself? Tonight, we stand before that unopened door. Beyond it lies archaeology, ancient texts, anthropology, art, memory, and one of the most fascinating mysteries ever left unresolved by the ancient world. To investigate what Jesus may have looked like, we must first leave behind every painting, every icon, every image created centuries later, and return to the world where his life unfolded. The journey begins in a narrow land pressed between desert and sea, a frontier province of the Roman Empire known as Judea. The year is somewhere in the early 1st century. Roman standards rise above fortified cities. Tax collectors move along dusty roads. Merchants speak Aramaic in crowded marketplaces while Greek and Latin echo through administrative centers. The historical record shows a society layered with tension. Roman power governs from above, yet ancient Jewish traditions continue to shape daily life below. Across the hills of Galilee, small villages cling to rocky slopes. Stone houses built from local limestone gather around narrow pathways. Olive groves spread across the valleys. Shepherds move through open fields. Fishermen launch wooden boats onto the waters of the Sea of Galilee before dawn. This is not the world of emperors and marble palaces. It is the world of laborers, craftsmen, farmers, and religious pilgrims. The evidence suggests that most people rarely traveled far from the place where they were born. Their identities were shaped by family, village, synagogue, and ancestral memory. At the center of this world stood Jerusalem. Its temple dominated both the skyline and the imagination of the Jewish people. Pilgrims journeyed there carrying hopes, prayers, and expectations rooted in centuries of sacred tradition. Some scholars argue that understanding this environment is essential to understanding the appearance of any individual who lived within it. Others remain unconvinced that geography alone can reveal a face. Yet the difficulty with every later image is that it often begins far from this landscape. Before we can ask what Jesus looked like, we must first see the world that looked upon him. Only then can the investigation move from imagination toward evidence. Now imagine entering a forgotten chamber carved into pale limestone beneath the hills of Judea. The air is still. Dust hangs motionless in shafts of amber light descending through a narrow crack above. At the center of the room stands a weathered wooden table. Upon it rests an ancient parchment, its edges curled by centuries, its surface stained by oil, smoke, and time. The writing upon it remains remarkably detailed. It records journeys, teachings, confrontations, and names. Yet where one expects to find a description of a face, there is only silence. This is the sacred image at the heart of our investigation. Not a portrait, not a painting, not a statue, a void. Around this silence, generations attempted to create a face. In the glittering mosaics of later centuries, golden tesserae formed solemn eyes beneath radiant halos. In dim churches illuminated by flickering lamps, painted figures emerge from dark walls clothed in deep crimson and royal blue. In illuminated manuscripts, gold leaf catches the light like fire trapped upon parchment. Yet each image appears long after the life it claims to represent. The evidence suggests that every artist stood before the same absence. Every brushstroke became an interpretation. Every icon became a hypothesis. The historical record shows no surviving contemporary portrait to anchor these visions. What emerges instead is something stranger. A man whose face became infinitely reproducible precisely because it was never securely preserved. This raises a deeper question. Is the true sacred image of this story the countless faces created across history, or the missing face hidden behind them all? In the imagination, the absent portrait begins to take shape. A man walks beneath the Galilean sun. Dust gathers upon his sandals. Light catches the folds of a simple wool garment. His features remain indistinct, suspended between history and memory. We can almost see him, yet not quite. Like a faded image beneath layers of paint, the face remains concealed. And perhaps that concealment itself is the most powerful symbol preserved by the ancient world. The deeper our investigation moves into the question of what Jesus looked like, the more we encounter an unexpected battlefield. Not a battlefield of armies, but of ideas. The conflict begins with a simple observation. The earliest sources remain almost silent about his appearance. Yet later centuries produced countless images claiming to reveal his face. How did that transformation occur? The historical record shows that the first generations of Christians lived within a Jewish world deeply cautious about sacred images. Some scholars argue that this hesitation contributed to the absence of early portraits. Others remain unconvinced, noting that portraiture existed throughout the Roman world, and that silence alone does not explain disappearance. The evidence suggests a tension between memory and representation. Was the physical face considered unimportant compared to the message? Or was a visual tradition simply lost to time? The difficulty with either interpretation is that the surviving evidence remains incomplete. As Christianity expanded into the Greek and Roman world, another conflict emerged. Artists began to depict sacred figures using visual languages already familiar within the empire. Some images portray a youthful figure with short hair resembling philosophical teachers. Others gradually develop the now familiar bearded face framed by long hair. Which image came closer to history? Some scholars argue that neither should be treated as historical evidence. They are theological statements expressed through art. Others suggest that fragments of older memory may survive beneath later conventions. Yet direct proof remains elusive. A further theological conflict appears beneath the surface. If Jesus was understood as fully human, would his ordinary appearance strengthen that claim? If he was understood as uniquely divine, would artists naturally seek visual forms that communicated transcendence rather than historical realism? The archaeological record cannot fully answer these questions. What survives instead is a landscape of competing possibilities. Historical fact, artistic tradition, theological symbolism, and cultural expectation begin to overlap until separating them becomes extraordinarily difficult. This raises a deeper question. Are we searching for a face hidden behind the images? Or are the images themselves part of the historical story we are trying to understand? Yet the debate remains open. As investigators, we now arrive at one of the most elusive stages of the journey. If the canonical Gospels do not clearly describe the face of Jesus, are there hidden traces elsewhere within the surviving literature of antiquity? The question has fascinated scholars for centuries. The historical record shows that a handful of ancient passages have repeatedly been examined in the hope of finding overlooked clues. One of the most frequently discussed appears in the writings of the prophet Isaiah, particularly the description of the suffering servant. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. Some scholars argue that early Christians may have associated this passage with Jesus and therefore imagined him as physically ordinary rather than striking in appearance. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that the text was not written as a physical description and may function primarily as theological symbolism. Another intriguing tradition emerges in certain early Christian writings outside the New Testament. A few later texts portray Jesus as possessing an appearance that seemed to change depending upon the observer. Some witnesses reportedly saw a young man, others a mature teacher. The evidence suggests these accounts reflect theological reflection rather than historical memory, yet they reveal how deeply ancient communities wrestled with the mystery of his appearance. There are also lost traditions known only through fragments preserved by later authors. In some descriptions, Jesus appears physically unremarkable. In others, he is portrayed as possessing unusual beauty. The strongest evidence comes from recognizing that these traditions often contradict one another. If they preserve memory, they preserve competing memories. If they preserve symbolism, they preserve competing symbols. This raises a deeper question. Why did later generations become increasingly interested in describing a face that the earliest sources left undefined? Some scholars argue that as Christianity spread through cultures rich in portraiture and sacred imagery, the desire for visual representation naturally intensified. Others suggest that the silence itself invited speculation. My reading of the evidence is that the hidden texts reveal less about what Jesus actually looked like and more about the evolving hopes, fears, and theological imaginations of those who sought to envision him. Yet the debate remains open, and within the gaps of these ancient writings the missing face continues to flicker just beyond reach. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where facts alone are no longer enough. The evidence must be interpreted. The symbols must be read. In the case of Jesus' appearance, the most powerful symbol is not a feature that survives in the historical record, but a feature that does not. The missing face itself becomes a symbol. The historical record shows that ancient cultures often attached great importance to physical representation. Emperors appeared on coins. Kings commissioned statues. Victorious generals filled public spaces with their likenesses. A face was power. A face was memory. A face was authority preserved in stone and metal. Yet in the earliest layers of Christian tradition, we encounter something unusual. The central figure remains visually undefined. Some scholars argue that this absence reflects a deeper theological pattern inherited from Jewish religious thought, where the sacred was often approached through word, covenant, and presence rather than image. Others remain unconvinced, noting that early Christianity eventually embraced visual representation with remarkable enthusiasm. The difficulty with any single explanation is that symbolism operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Archaeologically, the missing portrait reminds us of the limits of surviving evidence. Historically, it reflects the realities of a provincial Jewish teacher whose life unfolded far from the portrait workshops of Rome. Literarily, the silence functions almost like negative space in a manuscript, drawing attention precisely because something expected is absent. Symbolically, the face becomes a mirror. Each generation fills the void according to its own cultural imagination. The evidence suggests that medieval Europe saw a different face than Byzantine Constantinople. Byzantine artists saw a different face than early Christians in Roman Egypt. Yet every image claimed connection to the same individual. This raises a deeper question. What exactly were these artists attempting to preserve? Physical memory or theological meaning? My reading of the evidence is that the countless faces created across centuries reveal an ancient tension between history and symbol. The historical Jesus belonged to a specific place, culture, and people. The symbolic Jesus gradually became a figure through whom entire civilizations expressed their highest hopes, fears, and spiritual ideals. The strongest evidence comes from recognizing that both realities coexist. Behind every icon stands a historical man. Behind every attempt to recover the historical man stands a symbol that history alone cannot fully contain. Every historical mystery develops its forbidden interpretations. These are the theories that linger at the edges of scholarship, sometimes dismissed too quickly, sometimes embraced too eagerly. Our investigation into the appearance of Jesus is no exception. One controversial interpretation begins with an observation that appears almost paradoxical. What if the absence of a physical description was not accidental? Some scholars have proposed that the earliest communities deliberately avoided preserving details of appearance because they feared that devotion might become attached to an image rather than a message. The evidence for this theory is indirect, and many historians remain unconvinced. Yet the idea raises an intriguing possibility. Could silence itself have been a theological choice? Another interpretation emerges from certain early Christian texts that describe Jesus as appearing differently to different observers. In a few non-canonical traditions, his appearance seems fluid, almost impossible to fix into a single image. Some scholars view these accounts as symbolic expressions of divine mystery rather than historical memory. Others argue that they reflect theological developments that emerged generations after the events themselves. The difficulty with that interpretation is that it risks projecting later beliefs backward into history. A more controversial theory concerns the familiar image that eventually dominated Christian art. Some researchers argue that the bearded, long-haired face may have absorbed visual elements from representations of philosophers, rulers, or even divine figures already known throughout the Roman world. Others remain unconvinced, noting that artistic borrowing does not necessarily imply deliberate invention. The strongest evidence suggests a gradual process of cultural adaptation rather than a single moment of fabrication. Yet another interpretation proposes that the historical Jesus may have appeared so physically ordinary that contemporaries saw no reason to record his features. Some scholars support this view because it aligns with what archaeology reveals about everyday life in Galilee. Others point out that extraordinary leaders are often remembered visually, making the complete absence of description difficult to explain. This raises a deeper question. Which possibility is more surprising? That history lost the face, or that the face was never considered important enough to preserve? My reading of the evidence is that these forbidden interpretations reveal less about certainty and more about the limits of our knowledge. They force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The closer we approach the historical figure, the more clearly we see the boundaries beyond which evidence cannot follow. Yet the debate remains open. At this stage of the investigation, we encounter two competing theories that have shaped nearly every discussion about the appearance of Jesus. Both claim to bring us closer to the truth. Both possess strengths. Both face serious limitations. The first theory may be called the historical reconstruction model. Its central argument is straightforward. If Jesus was a Jewish man living in Galilee during the early 1st century, then archaeology, anthropology, and historical context can provide a reasonable estimate of his appearance. The evidence suggests that men of this region were typically shorter than many populations of later centuries, with olive to darker skin tones, dark hair, dark eyes, and features common among the Semitic peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. The strongest evidence comes from skeletal remains, burial sites, contemporary artwork from neighboring regions, and studies of ancient population genetics. Some scholars argue that this approach offers the closest path to the historical individual. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that it reconstructs a population rather than a person. It can tell us what a Galilean man likely looked like. It cannot tell us precisely what Jesus looked like. The second theory may be called the symbolic portrait model. According to this view, the countless images created across Christian history were never intended as forensic reconstructions. They functioned as theological language. Artists painted not what Jesus physically looked like, but what communities believed he represented. The evidence suggests that different cultures repeatedly adapted his appearance to express kingship, wisdom, suffering, divinity, or compassion. Some scholars argue that these images preserve spiritual meaning rather than historical memory. Others remain unconvinced because symbolism can gradually obscure historical reality. The historical record shows that both approaches seek something valuable. One searches for the man who walked the roads of Galilee. The other searches for the meaning later generations discovered in him. My reading of the evidence is that these theories are not necessarily enemies. They may be answering different questions altogether. Yet this raises a deeper question. If a perfectly accurate portrait from the 1st century were discovered tomorrow, would it settle the mystery? Or would it simply reveal that the mystery was never only about a face? When direct evidence disappears, archaeology becomes a conversation with echoes. The question before us is simple. If no authenticated portrait of Jesus survives, what traces of the world that shaped his appearance remain beneath the soil of history? The archaeological record shows that Galilee and Judea have yielded an extraordinary collection of clues. Excavated villages such as Nazareth, Capernaum, and nearby settlements reveal stone houses, storage jars, ritual baths, workshops, and narrow streets remarkably consistent with the world described in early Christian texts. These discoveries do not show us a face. They show us the environment in which that face once existed. The strongest evidence comes from human remains recovered from first-century Jewish contexts. Anthropological studies suggest a population generally shorter in stature than many later European populations, with dark hair, dark eyes, and features characteristic of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet the archaeological record cannot fully answer the question. These remains provide cultural and biological context, not personal identification. Another echo emerges from funerary portraits discovered in Roman Egypt, often called the Fayum portraits. Some scholars reference these paintings because they offer rare examples of realistic faces from roughly the same historical era. Others remain unconvinced that such portraits can be applied directly to Galilean Jews. The difficulty with that interpretation is geographical and cultural distance. They are parallels, not evidence. We must be careful not to mistake similarity for proof. Manuscripts provide another layer of echoes. Early gospel fragments preserve words believed by many communities to carry memories of Jesus, yet their silence regarding appearance remains striking. Likewise, inscriptions, coins, relief carvings, and monumental architecture from the Roman East reveal the visual world people inhabited, but none securely preserve his likeness. This raises a deeper question. What if archaeology's greatest contribution is not revealing the face itself, but removing impossible faces from consideration? The evidence suggests that each excavation narrows the field of imagination. It replaces fantasy with context. My reading of the evidence is that archaeology functions less like a portrait painter and more like a sculptor removing stone from a block. What remains after enough layers are stripped away may not be a complete face, but it may be the closest approach history can offer to the man who once walked those roads. Yet the mystery endures. The deeper we move into the ancient world, the more we discover that the question of appearance was never merely about appearance. To modern minds, a face often serves as an identifier. To many people living in the religious landscape of the first century, identity was rooted elsewhere. It was found in lineage, covenant, wisdom, authority, and relationship to the divine order. The historical record shows that Jewish religious thought emerged within a tradition profoundly shaped by the commandment against idolatry. This did not create a complete absence of imagery, but it encouraged caution toward the idea that sacred reality could be captured through physical representation alone. Some scholars argue that this cultural environment helps explain why the earliest traditions preserved teachings and actions rather than physical descriptions. Others remain unconvinced, noting that historical memory can preserve both. Yet the pattern remains striking. The evidence suggests that early communities considered what Jesus said and what Jesus did to be more significant than how he appeared. This raises a deeper question. What did ancient people believe a face could reveal? In Greco-Roman culture, physical appearance was sometimes associated with character, status, or virtue. Philosophers debated whether outward form reflected inner nature. Rulers used portraits to communicate power and legitimacy. Yet within early Christian literature, authority is repeatedly grounded not in physical beauty, royal clothing, or visible status, but in words, actions, suffering, and perceived divine commission. The difficulty with many later interpretations is that they often assumed the ancient world shared modern expectations regarding visual identity. The strongest evidence suggests a different framework. Theologically, the silence surrounding appearance may have directed attention toward presence rather than portraiture, toward message rather than image. Some scholars argue that this reflects a broader ancient belief that divine purpose could manifest through ordinary human form. Others remain unconvinced and view the silence as historical accident rather than theological intention. The archaeological record cannot fully answer which explanation is correct. My reading of the evidence is that the missing face became meaningful precisely because it forced communities to ask a different question. Not who did he resemble, but what did he reveal? In the worldview of many ancient believers, the ultimate significance of a person was not written upon the contours of the face. It was revealed through the life that unfolded behind it. Yet the debate remains open. As our investigation approaches its deepest layer, the missing face begins to reveal a philosophical mystery larger than history itself. Human beings vanish. Names fade. Cities collapse beneath dust. Empires rise and disappear like footprints erased by wind. Yet throughout the ancient world there existed a persistent desire to resist that disappearance. Kings carved their likenesses into stone. Pharaohs raised colossal statues above the desert. Roman rulers stamped their faces onto coins that traveled across continents. These were not merely portraits. They were acts of defiance against oblivion. They declared that memory could survive death. Against this backdrop, the absence of a preserved face becomes profoundly strange. The historical record shows that one of antiquity's most influential figures entered history without leaving behind an authenticated image. Some scholars argue that this absence is accidental, the result of time, persecution, and lost materials. Others remain unconvinced that chance alone explains such silence. Yet regardless of its cause, the consequence is remarkable. Instead of inheriting a face, later generations inherited a question. This raises a deeper question about the limits of knowledge itself. How much of another human being can ever truly be known? Archaeology can recover bones, pottery, roads, houses, and fragments of texts. Historians can reconstruct political events and cultural settings. Anthropologists can estimate physical characteristics. But there remains a boundary beyond which evidence cannot pass. The inner reality of a person remains partially hidden. Ancient philosophers wrestled with a similar dilemma. They asked whether truth resides in visible forms or in invisible meanings. Whether the essence of a person is found in appearance or in action. Whether memory preserves a body or a legacy. The evidence suggests that the mystery surrounding the face of Jesus forces these questions into sharp focus. My reading of the evidence is that the missing portrait functions almost like a philosophical mirror. The more we search for certainty, the more we encounter the limits of certainty itself. The more we seek the face, the more we discover the fragile nature of historical knowledge. Yet perhaps the deepest irony is this. Countless faces known with absolute certainty have been forgotten by history. A face lost to history became one of the most remembered presences in human memory. And that paradox remains as difficult to explain as the missing face itself. We began this investigation searching for a face. We arrive at its conclusion confronting something far more complex. The historical record shows that no authenticated portrait of Jesus has survived from the first century. That fact remains the foundation upon which every responsible inquiry must stand. The archaeological evidence allows us to reconstruct the world he inhabited and the general appearance of men who lived within that world. It offers context, probability, and historical boundaries. It does not offer certainty. The strongest evidence suggests that the familiar images dominating later centuries were shaped by artistic traditions, cultural expectations, and theological symbolism rather than direct eyewitness portraiture. Yet the difficulty with stopping there is that such a conclusion explains only part of the mystery. Throughout this journey, we have encountered an unusual convergence of history, memory, symbolism, and human imagination. Some scholars argue that the historical task is straightforward. Remove the layers of artistic interpretation and recover the most plausible first-century Galilean appearance. Others remain unconvinced. They contend that the cultural history of those later images is itself part of the story and cannot simply be discarded. The evidence suggests that both approaches illuminate different dimensions of the same phenomenon. Historical fact tells us that the face itself was never securely preserved. Archaeological evidence helps narrow what was physically possible. Scholarly interpretation attempts to bridge the gap between evidence and probability. Narrative reflection reveals why the gap continues to fascinate us. My reading of the evidence is that the ultimate revelation of this investigation is not the recovery of a lost portrait. It is the discovery that the absence of the portrait became historically significant in its own right. The missing face created a space into which every generation projected its questions, fears, hopes, and understanding of the sacred. This raises a final and perhaps unavoidable realization. The mystery endured not because the evidence was abundant, but because the evidence was incomplete. A preserved portrait might have ended the debate centuries ago. Instead, history left behind a silhouette. And within that silhouette, countless civilizations attempted to glimpse the man who stood there. Whether any came close remains uncertain, yet the debate remains open. And perhaps that enduring uncertainty is not a failure of the investigation, but the most revealing clue of all. The investigation ends where every serious historical inquiry eventually arrives, at the frontier between what can be known and what must remain uncertain. We began with a seemingly simple question. What did Jesus actually look like? Along the way, we crossed the landscapes of Galilee, examined ancient manuscripts, listened to the silence of the earliest texts, compared competing theories, followed archaeological traces, and watched centuries of artists attempt to paint a face that history never securely preserved. The evidence suggests that we can approach probability. We can narrow possibilities. We can remove many assumptions created by later centuries. Yet the historical record cannot fully answer the question that first opened this journey. And perhaps that realization is more important than it first appears. Some scholars argue that the missing face is simply one more example of evidence lost to time. Others remain unconvinced. They suggest that the absence itself may have shaped the history that followed, forcing generations to focus on teachings, actions, memory, and meaning rather than physical appearance. The difficulty with choosing between these interpretations is that both may contain part of the truth. My reading of the evidence is that the mystery survives because it touches something deeper than historical reconstruction. Every civilization leaves behind forgotten names, broken monuments, and vanished faces. Yet very few absent faces continue to provoke questions after 2,000 years. Why this one? Why has humanity spent centuries attempting to imagine a portrait that may never be recovered? This raises the final question of our investigation. If archaeologists were to uncover an authenticated first-century portrait tomorrow, and if we could finally look directly into the eyes of the historical Jesus, would the mystery truly end? Or would we discover that the deeper mystery was never hidden in the contours of a face at all, but in the extraordinary power of a life that transformed history while leaving almost no visual trace behind? As the dust settles on this investigation, the question remains open. For those who study history, theology, archaeology, and the ancient world, perhaps the most valuable discoveries begin not with answers, but with the questions that refuse to disappear. And this may be one of them.